welcome to ABC News. I'm Gemma Vaness. In the Emergency Security Council meeting in New York, Ukraine has accused Russia of attacking the entire membership of the United Nations. Their last-minute meeting was convened after Russian President Vladimir Putin's decision to recognise 2 breakaway regions of eastern Ukraine and send troops into the area on a so-called peacekeeping mission. A move the US ambassador to the UN described as nonsense. Meanwhile, Russia used the meeting to blame Ukraine for the Donbass incursion, accusing the West of egging Ukraine on towards conflict. For more analysis on this, let's bring in North America correspondent Jade McMillan now. Jade, what have we heard at the UN meeting so far?
Well, this urgent meeting was called at the last minute, fairly late into the night here in the United States, in response to Vladimir Putin's decision to both recognise these 2 breakaway regions of eastern Ukraine and also to send Russian troops into those areas on a so-called peacekeeping mission. We heard in this meeting widespread condemnation of Russia's actions. The US ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, was among them. She accused Vladimir Putin of testing the international system, of trying to take the world back in time to the time of empires.
He has since announced that he will place Russian troops in these regions. He calls them peacekeepers. This is nonsense. We know what they really are. In doing so, he has put before the world a choice. We must meet the moment, and we must not look away. History tells us that looking the other way in the face of such hostility will be a far more costly path.
Now, the US was not alone in its criticism of Russia's actions. The UK's ambassador to the UN warned of unimaginable human suffering in the event of a war. She also said that the UK would be announcing new sanctions tomorrow. We also heard from Ukraine's representative. He said that the UN as a whole was really under attack from Russian aggression, what he described as a virus being spread by the Kremlin. Russia, unsurprisingly, was defiant. Russia's representative defended Vladimir Putin's actions, and he really tried to blame Ukraine for the crisis.
We remain open to diplomacy for a diplomatic solution. However, allowing a new bloodbath in the Donbass is something we do not intend to do.
Jade, where are the US sanctions at?
Well, the US President Joe Biden has already signed an executive order in response to Vladimir Putin's announcement today. That order prohibits US investment and trade in both of these breakaway regions. The US at this stage, though, hasn't moved on a major package of sanctions that it has been threatening to impose against Russia in the event of an invasion. The US has warned for some time now that that package would involve severe and unprecedented economic consequences. At this point, though, a White House official has said that Russian troops moving into the Donbass region would not be a new step, that they have been there since 2014. That official was pushed by reporters on what that means. What is the trigger point then? What is the threshold for these sanctions coming into effect? They would only say that the US would be closely watching what unfolds in those eastern parts of Ukraine in the hours and days ahead. They did flag, though, that new measures, further measures, would be announced tomorrow. It's yet to be seen exactly what they will involve.
North America correspondent Jade McMillan in Washington, thank you. And joining us now is our Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedgetts and political reporter James Glenday. James, first to you, what is Australia considering in response to developments we've seen today?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and just to pick up on what Jade was talking about, I think it's going to depend almost entirely on how the United States and also the United Kingdom decide to act, and whether or not this incursion into these rebel-held parts of eastern Ukraine, held by Russian-backed rebels, it has to be said, whether that constitutes in the eyes of the West as a new invasion, and whether or not that reaches the threshold for these wide and broad and punishing sanctions we've been hearing so much about. Now, the Morrison government's National Security Committee of Cabinet, we're told, has already broadly agreed to a potential suite of sanctions, but the question is whether or not now is the time to implement those, or whether we might actually wait a few days and see what develops in that part of eastern Ukraine first. It is a very much a live issue. We're told it's being discussed behind the scenes, but whatever we do, we're going to be doing in lockstep with our allies. Now, the Prime Minister himself was out and about this morning, and he was very strongly condemning Russia's actions. Here's some of what he had to say.
Russia should step back. It should unconditionally withdraw back behind its own borders and stop threatening its neighbours. We've seen this behaviour before, and seeking to take opportunity to threaten a neighbour for their own advantage is just simply not on. It's unacceptable, it's unprovoked, it's unwarranted.
Stephen, if I can bring you in here, there are limits to what Australia can offer from all the way here on the other side of the world.
Yeah, that's right, Gemma. It's just worth remembering just how few levers we have at our disposal, at least compared to the United Kingdom and the United States here. And that's why, as James said, this is really all about an international coalition of nations working together to try and impose economic pain on Vladimir Putin and his regime. But unlike Britain, for example, Australia doesn't have vast holdings of Russian cash or stocks here in Australia. The Kremlin, of course, and people within the Kremlin have squirreled away billions of dollars in the United Kingdom through a variety of means, including, of course, property. And the United States has its own levers, very powerful ones, through its financial system and through the banks. So the United Kingdom, the United States and the European Union do have the capacity to impose real pain. Australia by itself doesn't. That doesn't mean that any Australian sanctions would be worthless. They would still have some symbolic value and would bite in some small measure. But it is worth remembering here that this is about a globally coordinated effort. That's what will impose pain potentially on Russia. Whether that's enough, of course, to dissuade it from its current course of action is a separate question.
And James, what other steps is the Australian government taking?
Yeah, so as we heard from Jade, the United States has put in place specific sanctions targeting those two disputed regions in Donetsk and Luhansk, in particular banning US foreign investment there. Now, it'd probably be pointless for Australia to follow suit, given the fact that we have very, very few interests in that part of the country, and therefore the government has been looking around at other things that potentially it could do. One is following the US's lead and withdrawing our remaining 3 diplomats from Ukraine. They were moved from the capital Kiev to the western city of Lviv a couple of weeks ago. They're now, we're told, going to most likely end up in the Australian embassy in Warsaw in Poland, which is not that far away from Lviv, just as a precaution. The other thing that there has been some discussion about, and a lot of this discussion has been driven by advocacy from within the local Ukrainian community here in Australia, is the possibility that a range of different visas could be offered in the event of a major escalation in the war and a major Russian invasion. Some locals have been pushing the Immigration Minister Alex Hawke to promise effectively a large number of humanitarian visas, even temporary humanitarian visas, and potentially even extend the visas of Ukrainians who are currently in Australia. The Ukrainian community is a relatively large community in Australia. There are about 50,000, according to the government, people in Australia with Ukrainian heritage, and about 8,500 people who live here who were born in Ukraine. And we understand that is something that the government is actively considering and likely to discuss at Cabinet as well.
And Stephen, there is of course another major world power that's yet to offer substantial action on the international tensions.
Yes, that's right. All eyes are, of course, on China. And a lot of eyes in Australia are on China as well. Of course, Russia and China, not that long ago, struck a new partnership that's been characterised by some as a new grand bargain or as a strategic partnership between the two. There's been a lot of speculation about whether Beijing has effectively given Moscow a green light to go ahead with this invasion. Certainly, China has not criticised Russia pointedly at the United Nations Security Council, for example. It simply called for all sides to show restraint. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Beijing is delighted by what Russia is doing here. We saw at the Munich Security Conference, for example, Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, talking about the importance of sovereignty for all countries, including Ukraine. And some analysts say that Beijing, whilst keen to buddy up to Russia for its own strategic purposes, is actually dismayed at just how reckless Vladimir Putin is being here, because it endangers Chinese investments in the region and it also upsets China-EU relations. So China could be critical here, and Australian officials in any case are saying they will be watching very closely